Hello there. I am so glad that you're joining us tonight on Fate Mag Radio. I've got a fantastic guest for you. But before we get started, I wanted to say thank you so much to the board of the Scientific Coalition on UAP Studies for doing a great event. There were so many presenters, and I love it because it truly is an international group of people, and it's all science based. So, me and a bunch of rocket scientists is a good time. And it was great to see Science Bob McGuire there, Mr. Lala. So make sure you give her a smooch. And I'm just really excited about having had such a great weekend because I've gotten really into this stuff. Who knew, right? Somebody else that's really into this stuff is our guest tonight, and that would be Brent Rains. He's a paranormal and UFO investigator. He is a multiple title author. He is he wrote with Rosemary Ellen Gully, who, of course, was such a friend of fate, John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. He has written with Brad Steiger, Visitors from Hidden Realms, The Origin and Destiny of Humanity as Told by Star Elders, Shaman, and UFO Visitors. With Timothy Beckley, The Edge of Reality, Dreamweavers, The Mastering of Time and Space. I'm like Grand Illusions, the spectral reality underlying sexual UFO abductions, crashed saucers, afterlife experiences, sacred ancient sites, and other enigmas. Because, Teal Gray, who is also a friend of the show, is one of my favorite sacred site visitors. And I just have the best time learning about this stuff. And if you saw the interview that I tried to record when we were in Arkansas with Brent, I'm so sorry. But I'm glad that he's back because he's fun, he's interesting, and it was my first attempt at doing that, and it was really bad. So he came back to do it again with Carl producing. So, Brent, I'm so glad that you're here tonight. Thank you.
No, thank you, Kat. It's, it's a great.
Well, I just enjoyed you so much. Got a little lag there, Carl. Is that me or him?
Good video, but just no sound, which is kind of essential to these things.
Okay,
So,
now I've got you. Can
so
you hear me
anyway,
now?
yeah, could you hear me? I was blabbing away.
Well, I could, but your video froze on me. So I'm glad that we've got that functioning again.
Okay, well, great. Well, I appreciate the introduction. Um, I think you mentioned Grand Illusions by my friend colleague Dr. Gregory Little, who has
Yes.
been working on my magazine Alternate Perceptions with me since 1985, and we're now up to issue 327, the June issue.
Wow. Isn't
And
that cool?
yeah, and I wrote the forward and afterward to that book, Grand Illusions and People of the Web, that 1990 People of the Web, Grand Illusions 94. And Joe and I will be joining Greg and his wife Laura in Ohio next month with the Association for Research Enlightenment. We've got a busload of people from the ARE, and they're doing an Indian Mouse tour, so that's going to be fun. Joe and I will get to lead some meditation type activity at a couple of the sites.
Oh, that'll be
Joan, my wife, is Cherokee background in her ancestry. She's related to a great, several times great Colonel Soto over in East Tennessee. We've visited his gravesite twice. He was a beloved man of the Cherokee, and she's been really very, very drawn to the Native American spirituality stuff. We used to have a sweat lodge behind our house, and have had a lot of interesting experiences in that regard. But anyway, so what should we talk about?
Oh my goodness. Well, I am pretty much game for anything. I I I had so much fun with you, and it was such an unexpected to do thing when we were at the Ozark UFO yeah, Ozark Mountain UFO Conference, which is one of my favorite conferences on the planet. It's small, not too small. It's small and it's
You know,
very up close and personal with a good group of people. And hello, Lori. It's a really good opportunity to interact with authors and experiencers. Um, it's just a
yeah,
fun
I
conference.
gathered that. Yeah, I gathered a lot of the people that gather there have had experiences themselves, and I
Mhm.
tried as much as possible that I couldn't, and I, wrote about it in my
Yeah.
Alternate Perceptions magazine about some of the people I met, including, of course, the MC, Forrest, who was had been in the field for years, worked with MUFON,
Yes.
and been at just about all of these Eureka Springs conferences since they started about 1980. And man, I mean, you know, he introduced himself that Thursday night when Joe and I first got there, and he sat at the table and said, "We have a mutual friend down in Huntsville, Alabama." Sue, I said, "Yeah."
Yeah.
She put on a conference there years ago as MUFON state director for Alabama, and
Yeah.
he spoke there. And anyway, he proceeded to tell me about when he was 10 years old. What got him into the field was he had a counterseen a disc-shaped object with landing legs that first saw it about 10 feet above a pasture, and then it came down, and he was with his best friend and his best friend's mom and dad coming back from a barbecue in the summertime, and they saw this thing off in the distance and stopped to see what it was. And as soon as they identified, hey, this is one of those flying saucers, he said, "I've never seen in all my years a grown man suddenly freak out like this." He got us all back in the, I guess, the station wagon, and said he down that country road like crazy. And days later, he still didn't want to talk about it. But he said that really put him on the path. And
Yeah.
I got to do an interview with him later about it. There wasn't enough time at the conference. There was so much going on. But
Yes.
I've got an interview with him in the I guess it's the June issue. Yeah. And yeah, I recommend people check it out because he's got some, over the years, he's had some spectacular experiences in the UFO field that are definitely high strange, as Hynek would have called it. So,
I think I
um,
like that as much as I like everything else. Just the fact that there is that, the fact that high strangeness is so varied and comes at you in so many different ways. I just,
yeah. And it
yeah,
really goes back at the very beginning, although, you know, and really with Fate Magazine 1988, I mean, the first issue was that, they had the Kenneth Arnold
hmm,
story of his sighting. And over the years, we discovered that there was so much more. And,
yeah,
you know, there was an early mindset that didn't evolve sufficiently that included the person. And we realized that, you know, I guess about a decade ago, there was an interview with his daughter, um, who named Kim, who described how right after that episode, the sighting he had of those 9 objects traveling at tremendous past Mount
yeah,
Rainier in Washington State, that a ball of light appeared in their home. And according to Kim, it apparently appeared in her you know, older sister's bedroom, and then apparently went down the hall and into Kenneth Arnold and his wife's bedroom. And he was so shocked that he jumped out of bed, fell to his knees, and he began to say the Lord's Prayer, because this was quite a startling experience.
right.
And there was just a lot going on, and in their life, and he saw. He had a feeling there was an invisible presence. He would see a something sit down in the chair. I mean, he'd see, the cushion just, sink, but couldn't see anyone visibly there, but felt that they were someone. And he had other sightings as well. He became a repeater. So, um, and then of course, at the conference was Kathleen Martin, and
Mm-hmm.
she's the niece of Betty Hill, and Betty Hill, of course, is one of the certainly a very well-known alien abductee, quote unquote, in the UFO field. Uh,
Yes.
you know, one of the early ones, and that whole story again is, we heard about an abduction and the craft, and she and her husband coming back from Canada down to the White Mountains, New Hampshire, in 1961, and there's uh, you know Betty says there's a UFO. Barney says no, 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 it's just an aircraft. And then he gets out with his
Right.
binoculars and looks at this thing and sees these beings in this, and he freaks out. And then they have this 2 hours of missing time and strange beeping sounds, and come to find out over the years, as you learn from Betty and other family members, there was other events that happened as well, that were again high strange. And
Yes.
and Kathleen herself has had experiences, and I think after seeing her and talking and hearing what she had to say at the conference, it's even escalated over the years, and some people have criticized her for saying describing some of these experiences she had now because they were so high strength they felt like it was hurting the image that Stan Friedman, the nuclear scientist who
But it didn't bother Stan.
wrote.
Stanton was not bothered by her
No,
doing that because that
I
was
know,
her
but there's
truth.
some people that have this rigid mindset, that you got to follow a certain path that's
Yeah.
acceptable, and
Well, Stanton had a certain
play.
Stanton had a certain
Yeah.
openness to woo, as it were. He himself was completely science based, but I interviewed him a couple of times, and he was not unfamiliar with the legends and the histories that had the woo factor, and he didn't mind discussing them. His writing was
Mhm.
not woo based at all. His writing was strict science. But I think that the special um, relationship that he and Kathy have made that possible for him to kind of embrace her and her experiences. Other people may have thought that it was derogatory of him, but I don't think he felt that way.
No, and I know that Kathleen introduced me to a Pam Nance out in, she's an archaeologist and anthropologist background in North. And she's had numerous experiences, and she really was very much into paranormal, and she was doing a talk, and Stan Friedman was there, and introduced them, she and associate of hers, to Kathleen, and then as I was interviewing Kathleen, she introduced me to this Pam, and she recently wrote an article about her experiences in my magazine, and there's so many people who are actually involved in investigations, like Forrest over there, who was the MC at the Eureka Springs UFO conference back in April, and they have a reason that they're in the field. They've been touched by these experiences, themselves. And there's a lot of people, but sometimes they don't want to come out in the open because, there's some people clash over it. I mean, for a long for a long time, the UFO organizations, the civilian NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which was founded in Washington, D.C. back in 1956 by retired Marine Major Donald E. Kehoe. And he wanted strictly nuts and bolts. He was kind of embarrassed by George Adamski, the contactee movement. He only wanted, good sightings by credible people, especially if they were Air Force pilots or, airline pilots, people with good credible backgrounds. And if they had repeated sightings, that was considered too woo-woo. And if, came out, stepped out of the craft, well, yeah, that's, and well, anyway, that's how that went. the Aero Phenomena Research Organization, that formed in 1952, that was actually one that accepted the occupants. And so we began to get reports from Central South America as well as across the United States and other countries. And, but, they didn't want the too woo-woo, though. They had to be like scientists who were collecting soil samples and whatnot. And I think sometimes the phenomena accommodates us to what in our experience is what we can maybe process. I think Greg Bishop over Radio Mysterioso over in LA has come up with this and talked with others. I don't know if he started or someone else, but how we're like kind of like co-creators of the UFO narrative, that the maybe the phenomena, the intelligence wants to approach us in ways that we can kind of it kind of appeals to our perspectives or notions about what the phenomena is, and takes these little baby steps in introducing itself to us.
Right.
And I don't know putting that right, but it's like for a long time these things are very similar to what happened in other cultures centuries ago. I mean, we could look at the Bible as those wheels in a wheel and so on, and say it was Ezekiel and Enoch were the early contactees, or experiences of similar things to what we're experiencing today. So, and Kathleen told me, because I visited, spent a few days down at Kingston, New Hampshire. Betty invited me down back in July '76 to visit with a family down there, and Kathleen's mom and their mom, and we went sky watching, meeting different people. And I heard about the house that Kathleen, their mother was living in, and about this ghost girl. And then I'm talking to Kathleen about it, and she said all that activity began when a UFO landed across the road from our house.
Really?
And I said, oh, yeah.
I didn't know that.
There was, kind of like poltergeist activity. One time she was visiting, and she was in a separate room. Her son was in another room, and he was quite young at the time, and she heard a noise, and she goes in, and he's swatting at an orb flying around the room. And so she grabs him up and takes him to her room for the rest of the night. And, the doors would open and shut. And, one of her former husbands was there one time. And a bunch of, as I recall, it was a bunch of coat hangers that flew out of the closet at him. So, again, like the Kenneth Arnold story, I mean, we hear just one version a lot of times of the story, and then there's these other things that were actually happening, but it might take us years before we hear all the details. I was talking to Albert Rosales down in Miami, Florida, he's a Cuban American, but he's had experiences his whole life, and that's what drew him into all this. And he's compiled a series of books about all these cases he's gathered. It's thousands of them from all over the world, and he gets them from magazines, books, he compiles them, and whatever data he can, and then he also people write him about their own experiences sometimes too. And I was interviewing him, and I said, probably what we're hearing, like some newspaper gets a hold of an encounter, close encounter, and we just get that one version. But if we could really, follow up on all these cases and, interview them further and ask them, about other instances, anything anomalous that they've experienced, we'd probably find that there was a lot of things that would surprise us, in their background. But usually investigator interviews them, and of course, it happens like often in the, if they happen to bring up, poltergeist activity, or there's something woo-woo, or runs across the backyard the following day, they say, well, that's not our department. We're here just about the UFO. So,
Right. Well, but they're not unconnected. If you have I mean, that one area of high strangeness often comes with a buddy, another type of experience. And because it's almost once you're known somehow. I don't really know how to explain that, but I know several people who had abduction experiences and then started having stuff in their house and then started having
Mhm.
other things going on around them too. And a lot of times they don't know which started first because they're like, well, am I having, you know, alien encounters because I'm already exposed to paranormal activity, so that's a draw. I just, I've only had two clients of mine that had more than, had multiple happenings like that. But it's just weird
Yeah,
that
it is.
once that top is popped, then you're fair game somehow. That's the wrong rule.
And
That's
it's,
not a good phrase, but kind of, you know. Have you
well,
found that
it
to be
seems to
true?
open people up. Yeah, it seems like in some cases it's a close encounter and an alien contact, or what we interpret as alien, some outside intelligence interacts with the experiencer. And it seems after that experience that they seem to open up and have either increased psychic awareness because maybe they were
Hmm.
already psychic and it seems to increase after experience, or else suddenly they realize, oh, I'm having these paranormal type events, or even cryptic
Yeah.
phenomena, other things that are happening in strange dreams, maybe, and synchronicities, and whole panorama of unusual things. Um, I thought maybe I might provide some examples.
I
Um,
love that.
yeah,
I mean,
huh?
this is about you and what you have to share and what you want to talk about. I'm just glad you're here. And
Well, I'm glad I'm here too. Thank you.
I get questions for you from what you tell me also because, it was so fun to get to meet y'all both. And I enjoyed our conversation so much. I wish that I had done a better job with my side of it. And I'm just so appreciative of you giving me the time to come back because you're a good conversation. You're a you
Well,
are
thank
a
you.
fun
I try. I
conversation.
don't know. Sometimes, I'm 73 now, and I know there's been a couple interviews where I would go off the rail and I'd start telling something, and then I'd go back and say, "No, what was your original question?"
Well,
Anyway,
sometimes when I'm having a conversation and we go off the rails, I won't even remember what the previous question was. So don't be
well,
afraid about doing that because we'll just pick up and move
yeah,
on. No worries.
but it's good. It's good we can talk. Whatever we say is recorded anyway. But anyway, there's one story that came up years ago, and John Keel wrote about this because I wrote a book on John Keel, and
Yes.
and I interviewed people who knew him because I had talked with him on the phone and corresponded with him quite extensively. So he affected my journey. So I wanted to. I decided I should write a book, and Rosemary Guiley knew him, and I interviewed her,
Yeah.
and she did a forward, and then she also helped me. She actually reviewed the book, made sure all my T's and I's were dotted and
Yeah.
T's were crossed and all that sort of stuff. And she was very good at that too. Maybe every page had little notations, and she would also suggested other people I should interview, because she knew
Hmm.
Keel quite well, and attended some of his 14 meetings, and she would. She even went over to the UK, to Stonehenge and places with him,
Hmm.
and had a picture that I included in the book where he was standing in front of Stonehenge. And so, and I wanted to let people know not only about, because a lot of people, including Rosemary, I was just going to write a biography about Keel, but I really wanted to talk about the ongoing mystery. So he set us, helped us set a lot of us, like myself included, on the path. Because my original exposure back in 1966 to UFOs was Flying Saucer Serious Business by Frank Edwards. And
Yeah.
the dog just barked. My wife just came in from next door. Everything's okay. And
Mine will go
anyway,
off when David comes home. So yeah, that's how that works.
yeah. So anyway, I got, I was on that strictly nuts and bolts. It's either that or it's, ET, or it's like the Air Force says, it's nothing to it. Just move on. But then I read John Keel and, of course, Jacques Vallée as well. And I realized, man, these guys are exploring a whole different terrain here. So I wanted to find out more about it. So that put me, and I started corresponding with Keel in 1969, a year before, he started putting out books on UFOs like Operation Trojan Horse and Strange Creatures from Time and Space. And so anyway, one of the cases he was really interested in, there was a massive wave of UFO sightings back in 1967 in Ithaca, New York. And I know that there was one article, a two-part article in Science and Mechanics by Lloyd Malin, July and August of 1968. And, one of the cases that really stuck out was this Rita Malley, a housewife with a couple of kids. And on December 12th, 1967 at 7 p.m., I got it written right down here to make sure, we stay on track. She's on Route 34 outside Ithaca. She's got her 5-year-old son in the back seat. And it says they suddenly, this domed, disc-shaped craft, making a humming sound, just over the power lines, and it shoots a beam of light down at the car. She loses control of the car. She ends up in an alfalfa field, and there's a chorus of voices. And she says, the voices named someone I knew, and it said that at that moment my friend was involved in a terrible accident miles away. They said my son would not remember any of this. Then the car began to move again, although still not under my control. We came up out of that field and over the ditch as if it were nothing, and then back onto the road. Well, the next day, this friend indeed had been in a serious car accident. Minor injuries, I'm sorry. But it was a serious accident. And so what this reminded me of was a case, this woman back in let's see, 1989, she was, her name was Martha. She lived up in Kentucky, a large farm her and her husband had and kids, and she was 49 at the time. She told me when she was about 5 or 6 years of age, she was playing out in the field, and this tall, maybe 6 foot tall, of course she's always been short, she said, but had a one-piece white and shiny jumpsuit on with a silver belt. And he removed from the belt this thing like a pencil, but it was longer than a pencil. It was silver colored, and wanted her to hold it in her hands while he had a small box that he was manipulating. And she had been sick recently, and so he wanted to check to make sure she was going to be okay. And so she held it like she was, and said she's going to be okay, and he'd see her again sometime. And then, years later, November 1975, when she sent me some drawings, her and her family in Kentucky had this close encounter with a large saucer-shaped craft, had a front glass dome on it, and she could see people inside like people. And then after a while, it rose up into the air, went off to the east, and she said just a tiny speck in no time. And then 1 or 2 weeks later, she said, she thought she saw someone in the house, an outline of a man in the house at the basement door. She searched the house afterwards. There was no sign of anyone. And then just shortly afterwards, first of all, her dad was in the hospital at the time, about 50 miles from her. and would go about 2 or 3 times a day to the hospital to check on him. But she began to think that, well, thinking she saw someone in the house was just something that, you know, was from being tired, and she just seeing things, you know.
Right.
But then a few days later, and it was at 3 o'clock in the morning, she woke up from some kind of a noise, and she had floodlights on each side of the house, and she could clearly see a man in the room. And she said, and I quote again, he walked toward me and sat on my bed. He told me to take my mother and sister, that my dad was dead. 20 minutes later, the hospital called. Dad had died. Everyone I know has changed over the years, but I'm sure this was the same man I had seen since I was a little girl. He hadn't changed. He looked just the same as the first time I saw him. And she would tell her, when she was a little girl, also tell her mom and dad about things that were going to happen, and they did. And finally, they told her to stop telling us the stuff. She said,
Yes, we don't want to know.
Yeah, but here's 2 cases of, 2 different people who, had a parapsychological event, but at the same time, it was associated with what we call alien craft, or a being, an alien type being. And then, I thought I'd add this too, because I thought this was interesting. I had a lot of correspondence, met a New England investigator named Joe Nyman, who used to also, work with people like Bud Hopkins and others. And he was very active in MUFON, and at one time earlier on in NICAP. And anyway, he told me one time, because he was coming across a lot of experiences with memories of what he called alien familiarity. And he says, I was told by an individual that at his mother's death in 1937, he and his 2 sisters were terrified to see a figure descending the stairs. The figure had a face that the man saw again years later on the dust jacket of communion. But, that's
I think a lot of people, when Whitley published that book, I think that a lot of people had that reaction. In fact, I remember reading about that. And
they would,
that was not an unusual, people
But it was
recognize
interesting
that.
It was interesting. 1937, right after the mother passed away, and seeing this figure on the stairs. So then, I figure, I don't want to bore anybody, but it's just that these stories exist. They are puzzling. They have been incredibly investigated, as much as we could. And back in the summer of 1975, I spent much of my time on the road in Florida, traveling around meeting people. And I'm originally from Maine, and in Ohio, which helped me a lot. Charles and Jerry Wilhelm in Fairfield, outside of Cincinnati, had started a UFO organization called the UFO. Let's see, UFO Investigators League, and that was Jerry and Charlie Wilhelm, and they had a basement, had a bed, and a little desk, and they said I could stay there and travel around from point to point. That would, so I wouldn't, which helped me tremendously, of course. And they had a case they were investigating, a Jim Miller and a Jerry Black, who worked with them. And I had already met Bob Pratt, and he got involved in this case. And as well as Dr. Ileo Sprinkle, the Wyoming psychologist, who also hypnotized a lot of experiences. And so what happened on January 6, 1976, these 3 women from Liberty, Kentucky, took this Mona Stafford out for lunch because it was her birthday. She was 30-something. And to a place, a town nearby to eat. And on their way back, they remembered seeing a flying saucer. a dome, disc-shaped object with lights around the rim. And suddenly the car was speeding up, and the other two ladies were saying, "Hey, slow down!" And she with her foot and says, "I'm not doing this." The car is
Wow.
speeding on its
I would
own.
have, yeah,
And
that's scary.
yeah, and then they had like 80 minutes missing time. They couldn't remember the whole, suddenly found themselves in another location. And but they remembered seeing this, the flying saucer. And soon afterwards, they had all these weird paranormal events. And so one
They go
time when I
hand
was
in hand.
going, yeah, when I was going down 75, 65, coming down toward Tennessee, which
Mhm.
I ended up, you know, staying in Tennessee. That's where I met my wife Joan, and here in Waynesboro, and I stopped in at Liberty, and I met the newspaper reporter who had done the original story on him in the local paper, and he said they seemed very credible church-going ladies. And I met Stafford's mother. She worked in a hardware store nearby. I spent a good amount of time talking to her and taking notes. And I met one of the ladies. Came to the door of a business. We couldn't talk long, but then I talked with another one over the phone, and then later Mona herself wrote me a letter. And I stayed in touch with two investigators, Jerry Black and Jim Miller, and got updates as things went along. But it was such a strange thing. If I can tell again the let's see. It's kind of lengthy, but I think it's significant. This is from Mona Stafford's experience after the encounter. And it said the story behind the face started January 9th. Mona Stafford, okay, this is the investigator writing, would close her eyes to go to sleep, and with her eyes closed, the one eye appeared. It looked like an ordinary eye, but it would scare her, so she would open her eyes quickly. July 7th was the first time that she saw two eyes. They also appeared as she closed her eyes when she was about to go to sleep. Then on the night of July 19th, Mona had been watching television, and the last program went off the air. Mona sat staring at the snowy pattern, back when we had TVs like that, when
Yeah.
she felt as if someone was looking at her. She turned and saw a man's face with bright red hair and red beard about 5 feet away looking at her. She turned away, afraid to look again. She felt as if the man wanted her to look again. This time, as she turned and saw it, she jumped up and the being vanished. End of quote. And, there were a lot of people, even investigators. Betty Hill actually communicated that suddenly she found a book of matches in her home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it was from a motel in Liberty, Kentucky.
Really?
Where did that come from? Yeah, and Bob Pratt, when he visited and they did the hypnosis with Dr. Leo Sprinkle of the three women,
Mhm.
to further try to figure out what happened during the missing time, and they did have memories of being in craft. Apparently, maybe separated. They were separated and maybe in different crafts. Maybe who knows? But they was what they described. Now, Bob Pratt told me that when they were done, they had a room at a motel where they were doing the hypnosis, and then they were leaving in a car, and he was in the back seat, as I recall, and he went to wave, and he said the ladies were gone. They weren't there, and he thought that was odd. They were just standing just before they took off.
Yeah.
And then one of the ladies wrote him, and they were waving at him, but didn't know why he didn't wave back at him. He said that.
That is so bizarre.
But the thing with the eyes is something that John Keel wrote about.
Mhm.
It's in a lot of different cases with experiencers. And he mentioned, I think, like with schizophrenic hallucinations, they sometimes see eyes and such.
Yeah.
People on drugs, but for some reason they happen in, like Barney Hill was describing interesting eyes, in relation to his memories of that first experience in
Well,
'61.
you know, have you heard his regression tape?
No, no. I mean, I've heard bits and pieces, that have been played over the media over the years, but not
Well,
the
it's
entire thing.
I was at an event where that was played, and it was horrible. I mean, he had such trauma and such fear, and it was the first time that I had heard an abductee actually in terror, right? And
Mhm.
because he was reliving it as they were recording. And I was so surprised because we had this vision, or I have had this vision of fairly benign research experiment kind of thing, right? And based on what I've heard from other abductees. And when I heard that, I had been doing this research for a while at that point, and I was so taken aback and I'm an empath, so I was very upset myself hearing that, feeling for him. And
Mhm.
I had not realized that it had been that traumatic. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't quite that. Have you come across in your research other people who were as traumatized?
Yeah, yes, some of them it has been, and you know, with Betty and Barney Hill, it was good that they had someone, like the hypnotist they had, who was very very experienced in that area, and and of course with Barney, he didn't want to believe it. Betty was open to it, but
Mhm.
John Keel actually, when he worked at the Library of Congress back around '68, '69, for some reason those tapes were there, and he listened to the entire recordings of
Mhm.
their sessions. But excuse me, yeah, it's presumably a lot of people say that after they've been through the hypnotic regression, they can adjust to the experience better. I'm not sure, uh, you know, but it's interesting too that a lot of the people. I know that Dr. Berthold Schwartz, psychiatrist from Montclair, New Jersey, who actually got in the field because of John Keel. Um, he noted that many of the people, like Betty and Barney Hill, and other experiences that he interviewed, and he'd done some hypnosis himself,
Yeah.
um, could go into a deep trance the very first time that they've been hypnotized. And he said that's not normal. That's usually maybe only 10 or 20% of a cross section of people. But for some reason, um, whether it was maybe induced by the trauma reaction and it takes them down to a deeper level with hypnosis or something,
Mhm.
or whatever the explanation, it's something that's I think a few other people had noticed it too. I think Philly and Dr. Jalen Hynek mentioned in a 1975 book On the Edge of Reality, where they sat down and they interviewed different people. They actually, I think, interviewed Betty and Barney Hill and some hypnotist, and they got onto that subject, about the high percentage of people who first time that they have a hypnosis session, they seem to go into a much deeper state than
Mhm.
the average cross section of people report. But um, and and mentioned Bob Pratt's involvement in the Kentucky case there, Liberty, Kentucky. He was actually for a number of years. Um, he took over UFO desk at the National Enquirer,
Mhm.
and the National Enquirer, they had a lot of sensational stuff to like, but they were actually very interested in the UFO subject, and they spent a lot of money sending people like Bob
Yes.
to places all over the world. And before I get into that, was there anything else you wanted to bring up? I could be jumping in there with, uh, you know, because I know I addressed the hypnosis thing, but maybe there's something else you wanted to add. Just go on from where I'm at now.
Well, we have a question in chat,
Okay.
and Anthony would like to know, do you think the loss of time plays a part in this? Are you talking about
Yeah,
the
it's
trauma, Anthony? I think that with a time loss, you have to be more traumatized because you don't know what happened to you while you were gone. You don't know what was going on. You don't know who was doing what. That would be frightening all by itself.
yeah, because then there's some experiences that feel their experiences were positive and even spiritual. So we have a
Hmm.
kind of a contrast. But I think even with those, I think there's been elements of missing time that crop up, and so whether it's like people who are mediums, like mediums will report that they have kind of like a missing time. They'll people ask them, a spirit takes over and presents a message, and afterwards they have no idea what happened. What was said. They have to have the people who were there to fill them in. As to what
Hmm.
they were telling them. But yeah, it's like an
Anthony said
altered state of
yes.
some kind, whether it's self-induced or not. But
Well, it
but
doesn't. I know people that can scare themselves silly, right? And enjoy it
mhm,
because they like that rush. Um, Base jumping would spring to mind, right? But
mhm,
but he was referring to the loss of time playing into the trauma. And I think because it would just add to that out of control, somebody's doing something to me without my permission, you know, and I can't stop it.
yeah,
That
it's not something you experience every day.
if you're
Uh,
fortunate, you
you
don't
know,
for sure. But I just
it's
find
a,
that to
it's
be alarming, that aspect of it. I'm
yeah.
kind of a control freak sometimes, not always. Depends on the
Well,
scenario.
it's always good to feel you're in control, no matter who you are. Um, but anyway, I was going to discuss this Bob Pratt, who he got to travel the world. Originally a hard-bitten skeptic, he worked for about 7 years with a newspaper as editor of a newspaper, as I recall, in Virginia. And during that time, if a UFO report came across the teletype, he would, crumble it up and throw it into a wastepaper basket because he always figured if there was enough time to spend on investigating it, you could solve it. There'd be a natural explanation. He was skeptical.
Yeah.
And then when he went to work for the National Enquirer, they wanted him to investigate the UFOs. So, I don't think he was too happy, but assignment is an assignment,
His favorite
right?
thing. Yeah.
So I met him. So I met him the following year after he had been assigned this job, and because he was up in my neck of the woods, up in Maine, looking into stories. We had a little wave of sightings going on, and he said, "Well, I've changed my mind." He went out, investigated the case with multiple witnesses, and he couldn't explain it. He talked to quite a few people. There was a sighting up around Michigan or something, and he really became quite involved and got to travel on the dime of the National Enquirer, and they were good at financing these things. And
Right.
but the one place that he really found intriguing was Brazil.
Was was
He
where?
had made
Missouri?
4 trips to Brazil in South America.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
yeah, Brazil.
A far
And
cry
he
from
had made
Missouri.
4 trips there.
Yes, much farther.
Yes, yes, very, very much so. And so, it was an untapped um location with tons of material. And and so I contacted him again right after his last, and actually a month after his last and 14th trip to Brazil, where he'd spend maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks, and he would have someone who was an interpreter because Portuguese is really what most of the populace speaks. No one hardly ever speaks any clear English. So
Right.
he did. He went around and interviewing people. Was very impressed, and said most of the sightings are like what we have. But he said, it was unique in Brazil. There were cases the military got involved, and there were really these unique kind of frightening cases where people were assaulted. And to illustrate that, this is what he told me in that interview um, back in May of 2003, right after he returned from his 14th visit to Brazil. He said some people were paralyzed during encounters, unable to move or resist. Some were burned by UFOs as they tried to run away. Others hid wherever they could as UFOs tried to find them. Still others found themselves in the grip of a powerful, invisible force as UFOs tried to pull them up into the craft. And sometimes people were taken away. UFO occupants have used hooks to
Whoa.
snatch victims from the ground in Brazil. They have dropped scalding liquids on others, apparently trying to make them let go of a tree or a bush that they were clinging to. And in one case of a UFO, dropped a slimy substance on a farmer as he tried to hide. Still, another UFO dropped a glowing bubble of about 1.5 meters wide that exploded silently in the faces of a man and his wife riding on a motorcycle. Sometimes people weren't safe even in their own because beams of light from UFOs would pierce tile roofs as if they didn't exist and burn someone inside. Most of these people recovered from their injuries, but several were permanently impaired. I have also investigated a few cases in which victims died during or after, and you know that's
Well,
pretty
that's not
pretty
bizarre at
scary
all.
stuff.
That's
Well, it depends.
that's
Maybe
that is the lab experiment theory. I see where that comes from. And Anthony was talking about the temples around there through Brazil, but this is a type of abduction that we do not talk about here.
yeah. I mean, some of it's very barbaric, like hooks.
Yes.
Taking someone up, and one guy was taken up, and his son-in-law was visiting his house and opened these wooden shutters to see what this guy was about, and he was being hauled up into this cone-shaped craft because he was on the underside. He couldn't tell what it looked like from the side.
Right.
He was looking at it from the bottom, and he's apparently, I believe this is the one who got hooked, and this little man came down and made sure he was hooked real good, and then they started pulling him up, and it was sort of a donut shaped thing, and in the middle was the opening, and when it got up high enough, he managed to kick his feet on the side, and it got loose, and he fell a good distance, 20, 30 feet, but luckily it was into a bush, although unfortunately the bush had thorns in it, but that saved him from any serious injury, except the trauma. And investigators were there soon afterwards, and said that, and of course Bob interviewed him later too, and he's had showed his injuries and such, and but what really was sensational, and Jacques Lee also went down to Brazil, and that's recounted in Confrontations, and I got to talk with Jacques Lee in an interview too a little bit about all of that later on, but from about September 1977 into 1978, there was a massive wave in Brazil, northern Brazil, But there's this island at the mouth of the Amazon where approximately 40 people, patients, from 18 to 50 years of age, had encounters with these in their body. A white light beam would come at them. It was about 3 inches in diameter, and it would strike the neck and torso area, and it felt almost as hot as a cigarette burn. And they also had like sunburn, but in the center of the burns, like 2 puncture marks. And they would have headaches, trembling, dizziness, red blood cell levels dropped after,
Well,
and then after about 7 days, they'd return to normal. But 2 people died while soon after the encounters. I think one had a heart attack. And what interesting, the Brazilian Army, Air Force, Brazilian Air Force was there in force taking lots of film and photographing these things. And the locals believe this was like chupas, or chupa chupa, a supernatural being of the mythology. And the local doctor, a lady, thought, that that's all it was. But after patient kept coming in, she began treating their symptoms.
Wait, did you say they thought it was
chupacabra? This is something unusual. And then one day she stepped out of her office, and there was it sounds similar, but they called it chupa chupa or chupa, and it was kind of like a vampire type being.
Okay, I was thinking chupacabra.
Maybe so this is my bad. Sometimes it incorporates. But anyway, Jacques Vallée said that he found out that it was an American firm that come by, because all these newspaper reporters were in Allen too, and they were taking spectacular pictures of these UFOs. And some American firm came down and bought up all the negatives from the newspapers. And he says, someone in America has proof that UFOs exist with these negatives. But the doctor said that this thing was just right above the main street. So people were shouting at me to run, but I didn't. I was too fascinated. And there's this, And so anyway,
I was just going to say, I don't know. This is a side of things that doesn't get spoken of. I've never heard of an encounter of that nature on that size level, where a whole region is being terrified.
That is, it makes you wonder, what's going on now. In December of 2005, I'd been invited to speak at the ARE, Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Edgar Cayce Foundation in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And Jacques Vallée was there. And I've been corresponding with this lady that Bob Pratt introduced me to, who would accompany him on his investigations, Cynthia Newby-Luce, who also had a professional background and master's degree in experimental psychology and anthropology. And she lived in a village up to the northwest, a small village northwest of Rio de Janeiro. And it's a very complicated name, so I'm not going to try to even say it here. But anyway, she was there. She'd come in to try to meet Jacques Vallée, and maybe me as well. But anyway, we've been corresponding. And then she also introduced me to this Brazilian general's daughter, who is married an American, lives in Virginia now, Denise Uchoa Slater. And her father was General Paulo Uchoa, and he occasionally comes, he and his wife, to visit her. And then she sometimes goes down to Brazil to hang out with them, So they're still a close-knit family, even though she lives in America now and they're still in Brazil. And his father was Alfredo Machoa. Oh, my goodness. I just touched you.
Okay. If I didn't have headphones in, there would have been a response. So it's all good.
No.
Earbuds.
Okay, it's okay. She was sleeping in a bumper. But Anyway,
Well, I
uh,
have a question.
but yeah,
You know, the stuff that we're discussing is not what's normally shared about UFO encounters as far as what happens in our country. And why do you think, I mean, is that happening here too? Yet it's being kind of kept on the lowdown in order to help the UAP disclosure movement not get a lot of resistance? Or why do you think that we don't have these types of reports here? Because I have gone through databases and seen different things, and I haven't seen anything quite like this in America, in the United States.
well, Bob Pratt did write a book, UFO Danger Zone, and Jacques Vallée wrote about this in Confrontation. So it is out there. Denise has 7 volumes written in Portuguese, so that when maybe when she retires, she's going to go through them and translate them into English.
Mm-hmm.
But she got these with the permission of her grandfather, and who was this respected Brazilian general. And lo and behold, she would go to the movie theater and hear about it. They'd have a little segment. Like at movie theaters, you have little segments about historical events or advertising or whatever before the, and she would see her grandfather um, on these, at the movie theater, in little
Right.
presentations. And one of it was because, as she told Bob Davis, I mean Bob Pratt, that's different from Bob. Bob
Yes.
Pratt was that she said, you're always hearing about, you've always been writing and telling us about these cases where people were injured and such in these UFO cases. It fascinated Bob. It says, I know a case where a person was healed.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was actually, and she, and after I met them at this conference in 2005, Cynthia Newby-Luce, who lived in Brazil and was this person with a master's degree in psychology and anthropology, and Denise went down to Brazil, and they met this Burnett Gomes, and she had developed CHAGAS, Chagas
Mm-hmm.
disease. And what had happened is a lot of people that lived in these little huts, and they lived on like a dirt floor, and there's this like beetle bug that comes around and bites them, and then it causes an inflammation in their heart later on, where eventually it kills them, and
Oh
there's no
my.
known cure. So anyway, General Ochoa, because this girl had been living with him, and they had helped her get through, go through school and everything, get her education, and so he wanted to do something to help, and he had been watching these UFOs, and he actually became a contactee, Brazilian general, and so, because his daughter Denise had allowed me to interview her, and she told me of her own sightings, going back as a little girl, and then later she actually formed a little group at her dad's college that he had in Brasilia, with other students, and they would go out, and one time he actually called one in, and so I thought, wow, like you, it's like, where have you, I didn't know all this was going on,
Yeah.
but the people in Brazil, so anyway, he she was about to die, and he went to a military hospital. He got General Choi got her out. He had told the aliens, if you do not heal her, I I will not have any more to do with you and publicizing the sightings I've had. So, because apparently they wanted him to awaken the public. So he says, our relationship will end unless you can do something for this girl. So he was instructed to take her out to an isolated location and set her down in a little chair, I think. And so this light came down. He said there was no reason to be afraid. Suddenly this blue light and a voice, and told her to raise her left arm. And then this being approached, and it was like an injection there. And she's lived many years since then. Very soon the doctors were puzzled by what had, her condition suddenly changed.
Mm-hmm.
And there was not all this fluid around her heart that had been there before. And then in April of 2010, her father went to the Armed Forces Hospital in Brasilia, and they got the medical records. And in a recent issue of my magazine, I posted an article about this in the June 2000. Wait, well, no, I'm not sure which. I would have to. I can send that out later, but it wasn't too long ago. About a couple of years ago.
Okay.
I did this article. Unfortunately, this was also around the time that Burnett had passed away in a car accident. But they also, Denise and her father had been out to L.A. MUFON, and there's also a YouTube of their interview, and they show a copy of the files and such, and talk about this case as well. So it's out there. It's not necessarily widely known, but I've done several interviews with, the granddaughter of General Lee Shore, and it's a fascinating story. I hope that she can get the all her grandfather's books, 7 of them, published. He early on was studying parapsychology, and as a young man, and suddenly realized he had a gift or abilities, and then this all so when he had investigating these UFOs in the 60s, suddenly he was somehow connected with them on a psychic level. And apparently, I read something online, and I don't know beyond that when these officers, military, were investigating the events at this island of Caleres with all this weird, attacks going on, that they would periodically brief him on the case and seek his advice. But I think how unique. We have a country where a general is an experiencer, and the military is consulting him about what's going on in one of the weird cases, And
would not happen here more than likely, but I can't see that happening here. But
yeah, but yeah, but then I don't know. We do have Jeffrey Mishlove, the clinical psychologist, parapsychologist, and broadcaster, who brings us New Thinking Aloud, which at one time was a public TV series back in 1986, 2002. And I contacted him not too long ago because of his involvement in the so-called PK Man. He wrote a book called The PK Man, A True Story of Mind Over Matter. And I found out that D. Scott Rogo, a parapsychologist who's now passed, but he wrote a lot of articles in Fate and other magazines, and was a real great parapsychologist himself. And he was a distant cousin of Jeffrey Mishlove's, and they worked on the PK Man story, this guy named Ted Owens. And so I wrote up an article on that. I wanted to contact him for the information. And when I talked with him, about John Keel and my friend Dr. Berthold Schwartz and such, he immediately said, well, I need to get you on my show. So I did an interview, with him. But then I got him to do 2 interviews for me. And we talked about Uri Geller, and we talked about Ted Owens. And Ted Owens, he wrote to me in August of 1971, when the same month when I went to Canada to interview my first contactee up there in Toronto. But I was just turned off by him because he sounded so braggadocious. I thought, nah. He told me, we had Apache ancestry, and he was the best night thrower in the world. And oh boy, I thought, okay. But that was just his way. He had a very high IQ. And fortunately, Jeff Mishlove stuck with him, whereas I wrote him off early on. He's talking about,
Right.
I've got these scientists who are working with me, and I don't have time for you and all this. I thought, okay, well, that's okay. But,
All good, man. All good. You do well. Yeah.
but he had all these, he tracked down all these documented instances of people who said he actually called down UFOs. He would predict something was going to happen, and it did. And even people saying that he would, during an electrical storm, lightning bolt's going to hit that church steeple. And sure enough, it did. And it was the only place lightning hit was the church steeple. Don't know if it was anything personal about the church, but anyway. And he says in December 1985, and of course I got these notes here from our interview. He said he was shaken to my bones. You got a call, and Ted Owens wanted him to notify NASA or something that something's, said this is the most important call you will ever receive. Now this is the kind of thing that, the SIs, the Space Intelligence, really mean business. They will destroy the shuttle. It's up to you to prevent it. Like, who am I to tell NASA? He says, January 28th, 1986, the Challenger exploded 73 seconds into flight. Crew of 7 lost. First fatal accident of American spacecraft flight. Verdict, hot gases from O-rings. But he was handed this case because he went to study CSRI. They went teaching some remote viewing. And Hal Puthoff and Russell Todd gave him the file they had at the time, said he actually did predict something. But what happened was one of them, Hal or Russell, wrote to him and said, you have real abilities. You ended the drought that you predicted it was going to end. And he says, he wrote back and says, I caused it. He's like the ambassador of the space people, and his view. He compared himself to Moses. But beyond that, though, he claimed they were trying to, the space people were trying to, but yet, whether you say he caused it, they caused it, or, it was a precognition, there were just so many cases that Jeffrey documented are in his book, The PK Man. Mm-hmm. And now there's a documentary that's being made, by the way, on this story. It's quite incredible. And I contacted one of his sons who claimed that, he had experiences growing up, that they were out in California one time, and Northern California, and his dad called the Space Intelligence in. 28 UFOs showed up. Said the craft may have touched down. It was just hovering, and we could see through the windows. They had small heads and were pale. My late father was packing guns on him. He could have shot a Bigfoot easy. Oh yeah, there were Bigfoot there too. But they just stood there on the riverbank. My dad had a huge flashlight, and he could focus on the squatches. Their eyes would be bright red. And I even found out that Dr. Swartz had sent a report to Jeffrey Mishlove about a case up in Brewer, Maine, which I didn't know about. They invited him up there to spend some time, try to call the UFOs down. They did see, and apparently the same son I had touched base with who told me that story also apparently had an encounter with something like a Bigfoot there, and there were also some poltergeist activity. So, yeah, that's quite a story there. Wow. But it just goes on and on and on. I thought I'd select some of these stories to kind of highlight how.
Well, one of the things that when we first met and we didn't know each other very well, I didn't know all of your background, right? Mm-hmm. So as I've gotten to know more about you, and I follow you pretty closely now, I like, you know, I'm reading through your work, but it's fun to me because you have so much history and stuff that I came to late. I didn't come TOO late, but I came to it late. And so although this is a fantastic time to be involved in this research because
Hmm.
there's so much happening right now. And and everybody's like screaming, we need disclosure, we need disclosure. Well, we kind of have disclosure all over the place. They're not going to be trotting out, you know,
Well,
graphic. I
even
mean,
yeah,
you
even the
know,
disclosure movement's kind of selective. I mean, it's
mhm,
just it's like they're really. I think the Pentagon, all they want to really basically pursue is the, well, I think they're maybe enemy drones. We don't want that, and they don't get into some of the real high strange elements.
uh-uh. Well, they're not
No,
interested.
no, it's just all about the military response, that might be needed or whatever, and
Yeah,
uh,
but
uh,
it's all over the place. The
yeah,
information is all over the place. The government involvement and stuff is all over the place. And what do you think? Do you think they specifically want to have the president of the United States and his cabinet walk out with men in, you know, men in black escorting aliens coming to do press conferences? What are they looking for?
well, I think a lot of them don't really want to even be involved. The kind of public opinion and reaction, wanting to have answers, and the New York Times article in
Hmm.
2017 really focused the attention hard on the fact that we have all these military. We've had military people experiencing lots of things like this, going way back to the very beginning. And
Yes,
and
we still do. I mean,
yeah, yeah, and there was I interviewed a guy a few years ago, a newspaper reporter over and also a ufologist over in Sweden, and he went back and interviewed about 50 people back years ago from 1946, before our world broke out, these ghost rocket phenomena, and it was very bizarre. I mean, they they had these craft, these rocket-like things, flying around from all different directions, coming into the country like Sweden and Norway and such from different directions, and lo and behold, they would crash into a body of water. I think they
hmm,
had four cases in one day where this happened at different lakes and such and ponds. And they might leave a crater in the water. It was like there was a violent explosion, uh, leaving no real traces behind, just you know uh, a crater or something in the water. They'd send divers down and they couldn't really find anything.
right.
Whereas during you know the when Germany was firing those rockets, they would leave maybe a ton or so of wreckage. But in these instances, they couldn't figure out. They assumed that these were guided, and they had a camera on board where someone was directing the flight. But it never has been explained. It went on for quite a while. There were all these instances, and didn't seem to really make any sense. They would hit the
Yeah.
water, and there'd be a violent flash explosion, and you know what was that about? And of course, there's a lot of reports of so many different beings. Uh, Apparently, outer space is just overpopulated with all kinds of strange characters. Little midgets and even little robot type beings sometimes, and then giants, even cyclops. I mean, is this a show someone's parading before us to really confuse um, our science people and military, or what's the educational factor here? What are they trying to make us realize? And I think somehow it's called it. Native Americans talk about the trickster phenomenon.
Uh-huh.
My friend Greg Little talks about how in the beginning of a vision quest, the Native American usually confronts the first thing is the trickster, and it's there to test you to see if you're worthy of further knowledge and insight, or if your ego will get the best of you. You
Uh-huh.
know, flatter you and say, we're going to give you the secrets. You're a very special person. Oh yeah, okay. and then you end up stuck in your little belief system. Whereas otherwise, maybe if you catch on to the game plan, that you may go up the ladder to really get greater insights and more understanding of what's actually happening. Um, so I've thought about that. The idea of there's a mind game involved, and see how you react to it, and what you may learn from that.
Uh-huh.
And so, I don't know. It's very confusing, but it's damn fascinating.
It is fascinating. And, when, because I've been a paranormal investigator for a good long while. And when I wound up being offered fate, I thought, well, I'm going to diversify, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to kind of go with what brought fate. And it was very hard to kind of break into getting people to talk to me. Um, Not so much now, right? But I was really, I was really lucky because I got to have conversations with Rosemary at events, but I got to interview Linda, and then I was just so, I feel like I'm so lucky with that. And
Mm-hmm.
now I'm not talking to people so much because I don't know why, but I'm part now of the Scientific Coalition on UAP Studies. So it's all the science behind the craft and stuff. It's not woo. And I kind of like both sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, everybody's got a, you know, it doesn't matter um, really if someone's got a different perspective than me. It
uh-uh,
doesn't matter
no.
because we need people. We can't all think the same because we're not going to ever work through this.
Well, because
Okay.
none of us are alike. We're all individuals. And but
Yeah,
I
and
think
this.
some of the people that you interview and some of the experiences that you share, they blow me away. I think it's fun. I think it's fascinating. Some of it's kind of scary. And I haven't personally experienced that side of the UFO phenomenon. And I have experienced craft being very close to me, but I haven't experienced any of the scary stuff to my
Right.
knowledge. But you talk to these people and it's really some very almost frightening experiences just to hear about, much less to experience as they have.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you find these people? How do you get them to trust you enough to open up to you about this? Because some of that stuff are very personal things that happen to them.
Yeah, it is, and I don't. Um, I guess I've been in the field for a little over 58 years, and so I've interacted with a lot of people, and some people I've been in touch with years, and I I know sometimes that mutual interest and trust that evolves.
Hmm. It
I've
does.
seen I've they get to kind of know you and your thought process and what you've been trying to research and investigate your ideas, and they share with me that, and there's a bond there, and um, I know a person who had experiences, and then suddenly she was approached and told not to be involved, and it really freaked her out. Um, and but yet, you know, I can't really go into it fully, but I mean, this was quite a departure from this person, and she had a son who was having experiences as she had, but not as intense, but still pretty wild, and then even had an encounter with a Bigfoot up close and personal,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't even know that his mom had a Bigfoot encounter at one point up close and personal, and she just wanted me to talk to him and reassure him, and then he's telling me things about what had happened to other family members, and she got kind of upset about that. But it's um, yeah, it's that kind of situations, and who were these two people that came to threaten her, and why did it I mean, she now doesn't directly deal with the UFO element. She'll maybe make a few comments off to the side to me, but she doesn't want the public exposure. She felt this was, I guess, government. I don't know who it was, but there was definitely an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, most people I have contact with, it's not anything that's to that degree. They just have questions. They're puzzled by it. It's challenging, frustrating.
Yeah, there's
they want answers, and said, "You've been in 58 years. How come you don't know more?" I
because
had a
there's
friend.
so much to know.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I've been told by a friend I started out in the field with back in the '60s. He was older, and so he was kind of elder, and took me under his wing and tried to explain things. And he was from the old school. And then a few years ago, he's reading my magazine. He says, you're kind of like more or less off the track. Why aren't you telling about the real cases?
Why don't you tell them about the real cases?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought I was covering the real cases, but I realized that, and that's okay. If everybody's going to be on their own journey, and I'm watching them too. I mean, I'm interested in some of the things that the government people are researching, what their interests are. From Skinwalker Ranch
Mm-hmm.
to State Research Institute, Uri Geller, Ingo Swann. Some of those
Yeah,
stories are quite fascinating, really.
they are.
Yeah.
I will
So.
tell you that the whole Skinwalker phenomenon, the first time I ever heard of Skinwalker Ranch was when I read a book written by a young man at that time named Ryan Skinner. And he
Mhm.
had been, the people that had put the locks on the inside of the closets and such as that had already moved out of the house. And he thought he was being coy and would trespass there. And he wound up being chased on his, I think it was just a mini bike, right? But at any rate, he was being chased by beings that I, I felt like they were looking for lunch, right? They were trying to get him. And he thought so too. But then as he got older, and he was in a pickup or in a car or whatever. And so that was my first exposure to Skinwalker. And
Mhm.
then I got interested in it. So I started, doing a little bit more work on that, finding out more about it. And then lo and behold, it's in my living room and my husband's addicted, right? So it's fun. But I've met people and I know people who work on that show. And I really irritated one of them at one time. But it's really interesting to see how this is coming almost full circle into mainstream conversations
Oh
because
yeah.
of and it's like, okay, so everybody and their brother knows about Skinwalker, knows about the high strangeness, knows about the ufology relation to it. And what I was really fascinated by was the the lead poisoning that they were getting out of the little cistern there. But things are being brought into mainstream conversations for reasons. And I find that interesting because the people that are have been beating the drum for full government disclosure, aren't even taking into consideration that there's kind of a softening. Are you feeling that? And by the way, Robert Gorman is in chat and said, two of my friends and colleagues, yes, I'll always be your friend. And he also says Skinwalker Ranch adapts depending on the visitors. I would agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. It's that co-creational effect, and it seems to conform to sometimes people's expectations and belief systems, and maybe the trickster effect there. Yeah, and I've known Bob Gorman quite a number of years. We actually met. I traveled around. I did one of my first trips. Me and a buddy from high school traveled down to Mount Misery, Long Island, where John Keel had written about strange things there, and then across Pennsylvania. I ended up at Bob Gorman's home there near Pittsburgh, New Kensington, and spent a couple days there. That was back in April of 1972. We were both just about 20 years old. That's a lot of water under the bridge there. But anyway, yeah, we're still both at it. But
I think that he's pretty special.
Yeah, so. And we both had a lot of interest in the MIB phenomenon.
What was okay? Now you're going to have to go there. I want to hear about your MIB experience or experiences, because that is something that I just love. I have been so interested in that. I found Graham Parker's book, Gray Parker's book, and I just became fascinated by that topic. And you've actually had encounters?
No, I mean, I don't know what they were exactly, but no, mainly just as an investigator, meeting people. I met some people that people thought regular human beings. They thought they were maybe kind of, involved in it to where they became obsessed with the MIB to where they felt they were actually being controlled by the intelligence to perform MIB type activity, human beings, and develop psychic powers or whatever. I know outside of Philadelphia back in 1972, I was there investigating a couple of men, one of whom they were very deep occultists, and they were known by the local occult community, witches and so on, who I went around talking with. And people were actually afraid of this one guy who had a lot of characteristics similar to an MIB. And one woman told me she met him on the astral plane, and he was like a hooded, sinister-looking figure, and didn't want to mess with him. And I step outside of this place where all these, I can't remember the name of the building, but it was a group where metaphysical people like to gather and talk. And this one guy who knew these two guys, this guy just happens to be there in his car. And I'm told, hey, Brent, you need to meet this guy. And essentially, I'm shoved into the car with him. And, he's the guy that people were, kind of saying they were shaken up and had weird experiences with.
Right.
So, I was trying to interview him and question him. And he was very sharp and talk about someone you couldn't really pin down. would, ask him whether you've had out of body experiences. What kind of energy do you have, and so on. And he would answer, but it was always in a way that didn't really answer the question.
Right.
And so finally he says, "Why don't you let me ask you the questions?" And I said, "Okay, fair enough." and so he started talking about, now, MIB. I know you're interested in MIB. He says you're really not interested in just documenting one case after another. You want to figure this out. What does it all mean, and what is it, that covenant says? Like right now, I could be diverting your attention to something you had planned, and the plan was that center that we were at. My friend Floyd Murray was going to arrange for us to spend the night and do a ghost hunt. That after meeting him, though, that got ruined. So I thought, and it was just, and then at the end of it, he had a convertible and he put the hood up and he turned the heater on. I thought, what the hell? And it's getting warm, and it was not it wasn't a cold night or anything. And then he started talking about, I wonder what it'd be like to cut the fingers off an MIB, see if he's a robot or a human, and giggled.
Oh, my.
I said, okay. And so I think I terminated the conversation at that point. I felt like I'm not really getting anywhere constructive.
Did you leap from the car and run?
No, I don't think I actually run. But anyway, it was an interesting experience. There was a lady, a psychiatric social worker from England who lived nearby, and she was a uffologist, and she was having what she said were genuine MIB problems and strange poltergeist effects in her home. And these two men took care of it for her. And so she really thought that they had something going on. And Floyd Murray said that he had a Kundalini type experience one night. And afterwards, he was able to engage in conversation with him about the occult and things at a level he hadn't previously.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know there was a case not too far from there where this guy came in. There was a guy transcribing reportedly an MIB encounter. And while I was doing that, suddenly this dark-suited man appeared in this bookstore where he was working. And he apparently didn't know how he'd get in. Apparently the door was locked. And then he escaped, but it left behind a identification card, which said he was with military intelligence. And
not very if he left his card.
Yeah, it sounds deliberate, doesn't it? But somehow
that sounds entirely deliberate.
Yeah, but the police came and documented. But apparently, hey, what are we supposed to do with this? I mean, you say you're writing up this thing, and so I don't think much happened there. But it was a colleague of John Keel's that actually, a guy who used to live next door to him that was sharing this episode. And the lady psychiatric social worker from England, I learned that this guy that people thought was kind of MIB looking actually would send secret little messages to John Keel. I don't know what they consisted of, but through her, he would have her send it enclosed with her letters to him. So I know John Keel got his share of strange letters over the years.
Okay, I want to take you back in this conversation when you were talking about having a Kundalini experience. What would that be like?
Well, it depends on the person. There's a lot of people who are experiencers that feel they've had the Kundalini. I know Dr. Bob Davis, who's a neuroscientist, worked with, I got to know him really well when working with the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences back a few years ago with Ray Hernandez and others. That, he went to Australia, and there was a woman, a former medical doctor, who was channeling spirit alien messages. And he said suddenly while he was there, he was experiencing these uncontrollable movements, He had these feelings that, he said he became like a tree hugger afterwards. And he um, he said this stuff is real. I talked to him on the phone afterwards. Brent said, I had these reactions that people described when they had Kundalini, and I would I think it was he went out. Yeah, he went out to Sedona, and he couldn't stand to be around crystals, quartz crystals.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, there's another person told me that they went to Sedona, and the quartz crystals affected them too. They were contact experiencer, but I met him a few years later. Him and Nancy Tortry, who's also a former attorney from New York and has had her own contact experiences. She wrote How to Talk to an Alien,
Mm-hmm.
and we were sitting in a library talking about all this weird stuff, and he said, "Now, he says when I just relax, and if I don't, he said it would look weird if I was doing a podcast and I did this." He says, "But I'm going to show you what happens to my face and so on, the weird movements, uncontrolled movements. I keep it under control now." But he said there's this energy. There's a name for it. He says it's known, but I can't remember what the name of it was. But yeah, he had um, weird facial thing going on. He's a neuroscientist, PhD. But I also contacted and interviewed the doctor down in Australia who, you know, was channeling, and her experiences came about when she lost a young son to a car accident, and then she later revisited the site and she saw a ball of light, and then all these other experiences started happening. And now she goes to India periodically to learn about higher knowledge and understanding, and she says that when she's communicating, channeling, that sometimes people have weird experiences. Sometimes they'll see beings or whatever. So that was how Bob said it happened to him. He had previously seen two UFOs out at Sedona, Arizona, years ago, and so he'd always been interested in the subject. But of course, as a neuroscientist, while he was employed, he didn't go around talking about it. But now that he's retired, he's full steam ahead. He's recently released a documentary, and along with a person down in Florida who's assisted him, who does that kind of work. They traveled all around the country, and Monroe Institute and Stanford to meet Gary Nolan and all kinds of different people. So he's on the path.
Yeah.
And one of the first people I'd ever met who described that was a young lady in 1975 up in near Akron, Ohio. Sat down with me and told me that she had a healing. This being appeared to her and took like some sort of round thing out of her head, and it was just a weird experience But later on, she had other experiences, seeing UFOs and such, as a young girl,
Right.
and she had the healing, and she also felt that she had a greater insight into. I don't know what happened to her. I had contact with her, I guess, for a few years there, but follow up is much more important than I realized. Years later, I thought I should have done better.
Well, I think when we go forward, we always look back and say, I should have done better in different things. The reason I asked about the Kundalini is because it is really hot right now. I see it being discussed in a lot of different venues, and it surprised me because it's ancient, and all of a sudden people are like, "Ooh, let's do Kundalini," and I'm like, "Do it," experience it, you know.
Yeah.
But it's really, it caught my ear when you said that. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Well, um, I even saw somebody brought to my attention a YouTube video with the late great psychologist, Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who was, of course, into archetypes. And one of his last books before he died was on flying saucers, modern myths of things seen in the skies.
Mm-hmm.
And, he said some very interesting things. And in this one particular YouTube, he was talking about a woman he met who seemed highly intuitive, and she was describing having a Kundalini experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, way back then, the guy who was interested in the archetypes of flying saucers was also talking about this woman he met who was describing what people would, from the East would call Kundalini awakening or something. And yeah, so, but
Just synchronicities.
Yeah, a lot of synchronicities. I've, back when I finished up with my, came back to Maine from the summer of 1975, and I was going through kind of a crisis. I say a spiritual crisis, because I accepted Christ back in May of 1975, and then I went on this journey, and some people tried to talk me out. I said, no, I've been planning this for years. And so I was going around the country and doing experiences of researchers, and no regrets there. But I was hearing so many different versions of what to believe spiritually, and finally I just asked Creator, show me. But one condition, I don't want, I know, like reading the book of Revelation, I can see some pretty scary things happen to people for, insights. So, yeah, I didn't want that. So, not even thinking about that, 2 nights later, I awakened. I go to bed, and it's just a little after 11 o'clock, and I'm crawling into bed. Usually when I crawl into bed, I'm under the covers, and I lay on my side or my stomach. And in this instance, I crawl in bed, and suddenly I say, oh, I'm walking toward the bedroom door. It's the door is open, the hall light's on. My dad's making his pit stop in the bathroom, and but then I realize someone's holding me back. I stop in the middle of the room, and someone's holding me back. But instead of turning around, I continue to look at the door. I know that that's what I'm supposed to do. And only reflecting on it later do I realize how strange that all was,
Right.
And suddenly all these little tiny marble-sized balls of light, pulsating, pure white, translucent, they're just flying around, and they seem to be forming like a small four-legged animal at the base of the door. And then before it finishes forming, I'm snapped. This is like seconds, like just a few seconds, and then suddenly I'm back in bed. But the thing is, I recall that I was laying on my back looking up at the ceiling. Why was I doing that? I usually, when I'm bone tired, like I was,
Right.
I was headed for bed, and I should have been in the bed with the covers over me. So, of course, my father came out of the bathroom and went downstairs, so I followed him, and I told him what had happened. He said, well, that was quite a dream. Well, I've never had a dream like that.
Right.
That just seemed so real. But anyway, a few years ago, this is where I started having a lot of synchronicities. I did this thing that Carl Jung recommended, and I tried to pull all this information together how to do it. I was wanting to see if I could find some answers. So I think it's called creative or active imagination. Yeah, that's it, active imagination. So I went through all my Jung books, and I wasn't, able to pull it all together, but I figured, well, I got enough. So I'm laying in bed, and I'm not supposed to guide the images. They're supposed to guide me. I'm not, I'm supposed to try not to prejudge, which is very hard, And anyway, in the end result is that I fall asleep and I awaken back in like the 1975 bedroom I was in up in Hallowell, Maine, of my parents,
Yes.
and it's like there's other people in the room, and I don't know them, and I'm kind of, who is this? But then my mom appears in the center of the room where I was in 1975. My mom's passed away, and I go up to her, we hug, and my mom was never really approving of my interest in UFOs, but here we were, that seemed, everything's okay.
Yes.
And and then that was it. But then a couple days later, I get this email from a lady in Nashville who I've met, who seems to be quite psychic, and also has this great story she shared with me, where she'd written down this account from her mother before she passed away back in the 1950s, lived in Texas, and had an experience where one night her husband's at work. She would always read a book while, at night before going to bed. But this night was disturbed by a flying saucer landing and a little man getting out and having that experience. And she went to a preacher and tried to, at a church, and tried to get some understanding, and he was no help at all. And eventually she began to develop at the psychic level, and so has this woman and her sister, and over the years. And so anyway, she wanted to, she said, I'd like to share this experience with you. Well, in her experience, which was the day before my experience, as it turned out, I was coming to her house as a TV repairman with some other people, and her deceased mother was there, and telling things and communicating things about me. And I thought, wait a minute, you had a dream where your mother was, and so it was like you didn't, but it was like a karma thing. And then I think it was about a month later, another woman up in Missouri I had investigated, because she had ghost experiences, UFO experiences, and so on, said, Brent, I had this unusual experience. I got a sunburn having a dream. I said, okay, can we talk this evening? Sure. So we. What happened is she was in this building, and there were people who was crouched down on the floor. She was the only one standing, and there was these glass windows, and there was a bright light outside, and her mother appeared and said, you don't need to be alone at this time. And they hugged, and then there was a bright burst of light, and then she said she woke up with a sunburn. And I thought, okay, another mother dream. So, the synchronicities were starting to add up, and then there were just, and then there was this young lady out in Las Vegas, and I'd been in touch with her mother, and had heard about her children having all these UFO psychic experiences and all that. And her daughter just had recently a UFO encounter and heard strange noises in the house. And so I'm communicating with both of them. And then the mother tells me that her daughter's also recently developed a psychic awareness of knowing things. And I said, okay, let's do an experiment. And what could maybe she pick up about me right now? And I didn't understand it all, but she'd come up with this woman's voice, an older person, and sounded like a woman maybe with a smoker's voice, and gave these initials. I thought, I was racking my brain, who on earth I know that has these initials? Of course, I was thinking about the UFO field. Mm-hmm. And then finally I gave up. I just gave up. And then 2 nights later, I have a dream, and I meet this Margaret Ross, a lady from up in Ohio who had passed away recently. And she would come down here once a year and visit what we call the fitness spa, and mm-hmm. she would do Tai Chi. She was also a psychologist, and she loved to it was just her. She didn't have any kids or whatever. So once a year, she would also go off to some place in Costa Rica or down in Brazil and have an adventure, and come back and show us the pictures and so on. We'd go out to a restaurant. And so anyway, suddenly I was going out to this place down this road, and then there she was outside this gym, which I had seen her before, like outside this gym where she would introduce people to Tai Chi. And I woke up like early in the morning, and I thought, wow, wait a minute. And I rushed off the computer, and she had the very same initials,
Yeah.
as this person said. And she was certainly an older person. In fact, we had sweat lodge behind the house, and she came out of it the first time I met her. And she was up in her 80s. And someone asked her, well, what are you going to do with the rest of your life now? She said, well, just keep looking forward and keep going. I'm just a baby, learning new things and such.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I went back to sleep after that, and I thought, wow, the same initials. And I woke up about 20 minutes later, and it was like a message from her, and it was about aging, and it says, you may feel like an old pair of socks. You got holes, in the socks, but you can still wear them. You can still go on.
Yeah.
And I wrote it down, right, because I knew I'd forget it if I didn't write it down at the time. But it just seemed like for a while there was, after that active imagination thing that I tried,
Yeah.
that all these, it just, had all these synchronistic events that were happening,
You know what? We're out of time.
Yes, I know we're, yep, we just got, short period of time, a couple minutes.
We're going to have to do this more often. I really enjoy you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Enjoy talking
And I
with you.
appreciate you.
But, it's, I feel like John Keel used to write his business cards, not an authority on anything. I'm this, I'm that, but,
Well,
I had a hard time.
I had a hard time deciding how to present you because you are so diverse and you have so much knowledge and background. And I just appreciate so much that you came back on with me.
Well, I appreciate that you invited me and we could do this again. I enjoyed meeting you at Eureka Springs. And even though the recording didn't, we got to talk a lot of stuff over anyway.
We did, and it was fun.
And it's probably a little different than what we talked about then, but anyway.
It's still great.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. And thank you for having me as a guest.
Well, thank you for being here. And for all of the people listening, and Robert said loves us both, which is good. I love him too. But we will bring you this again, and I appreciate y'all being here. If you have not checked out Brent's sites, go and find his books on Amazon. You will love them. And just your history. You're just brilliant, and I enjoy you. Thanks again for being here.
Well, I don't know, but anyway, thank you. And Alternate Perceptions once a month, apmagazines.info.
Yes.
Yes. It's a good networking tool for me. It keeps me busy looking into different aspects and things. So again, thank you. Appreciate it. And
thank you.
Just name the time and I'll be there.
Thank you. And for everyone listening, y'all be blessed. Have a great week. And we will see you next time. Same cat time, same cat channel. Good night.
All right. Okay.